All right, everyone. We're back with yet another interview for South Carolina Archaeology Month 2020. Our theme this year is Avocational Archaeology, and I've been interviewing a number of people who have been prominent in avocational archaeology across South Carolina. And today, my colleague Bob Costello has agreed to do an interview, and I'm delighted. Bob is recently retired from the University of South Carolina, Sumter, where he taught chemistry for over 40 years and was began his career at the university in Columbia. And so he's a doctor, but he's not a doctor of archaeology. He's a doctor of chemistry. And he's used some of those skills in his archaeological exploits. And Bob's unusual in a number of ways. He has come to the Archaeological Society's annual conference since 2007, I believe, and given a paper every year. And he also has 12 published papers in the Archaeological Society of South Carolina's journal, South Carolina Antiquities. And I believe that record on both counts beats me and beats many of our colleagues. And so we applaud you for that, Bob.
Thank you.
And thanks for doing the interview today. My first question for you is, I want you to tell us about growing up in Chapel Hill and how you first started to collect Native American artifacts.
Well, my inspiration was my parents. My father was a zoology professor, but loved the outdoors. And back before I was born, he found an arrowhead in his backyard and got interested in Native American history. And back then, Geoffrey Coe was at UNC, and he talked with him and went on some field trips with him and got totally consumed by archaeology. And he and my mother went out in the fields around Chapel Hill and on the shore of University Lake and picked up arrowheads. One of our favorite activities at home was opening up his boxes of arrowheads and looking at his arrowhead collection. It was fascinating. And back then, Chapel Hill was a small town. Didn't have a hospital of its own, so I was born at Duke, of all places. But back in the mid-1940s, we did a lot of walking around in the fields around Chapel Hill. He knew a lot of the farmers, and we picked up arrowheads and a little bit of pottery. And Chapel Hill was very rural. You could at times walk for miles and not run across a road. I could walk down the hill from our house on Monroe Street and across a cornfield, and there was Morgan Creek and wild hills up on the other side. It was a great place, which has changed a great deal with urbanization. But my mother once commented to me that if she wanted to see my father on weekends, she had to go along with him on these trips to the fields. So that's what I grew up on, the habit of looking for things in fields and looking down and finding interesting stuff. In the summers, we went to Cape Cod, and up there it was beachcombing, finding stuff, flotsam that had come in. So even found a net float one time. So this habit of walking around and looking for stuff is something that was deeply ingrained in me from a very early age. And I find still when I walk around almost anywhere, I'm looking down and seeing what's there and trying to recognize patterns. If I'm at Myrtle Beach,
problem in all archaeologists, I think.
If I'm at Myrtle Beach, I'm looking for shark teeth. I remember one time I jogged 5 or 6 miles along the beach thinking I might see a shark tooth, and it turns out that's not the way you find stuff. You have to go slow and really look.
I got you. So listen, you got your undergraduate degree in zoology, and then you went out to the West Coast to Stanford and got your PhD. It seems like there might have been a bit of a gap between your interest in archaeology. How did you get back?
There was about a 50-year gap.
50-year gap.
Yeah.
So what triggered a return to this interest?
Well, I think the collegiality of John Logue, who was a naturalist and botanist and was interested in archaeology, he took me to out in his canoe one time on Lake Marion around 2000, we had heard that people were finding whole pots on Persanti, and I don't know whether that was true or not, but we just had to go up there. So we put in down at the wildlife refuge and paddled up and looked for stuff. And then I went on another trip later with him in one of his kayaks. He had two of them. We both paddled up there. Soon decided that if I wanted to be independent and go frequently, I should buy my own kayaks. And John told me about Great Wide Open Outfitters in Sumter, and they had used kayaks that they were allowed to sell after they had used them for a certain number of trips. They took tours out and trips and tried to hook people on buying kayaks that way, but they were allowed to sell them as used after a certain number of trips. So I actually ended up buying 3 kayaks, a 2-seater thinking I would take the family out frequently, which has not happened, and a little Acadia, which is a small 1-seater with 1 cargo hold, and then a big Captiva, which is 16 feet long and has a big hold up front and another one in the rear, hold a lot of cargo, and that's what I've been using. And I started going on kayak trips along the shore of Lake Marion and finding some fantastic stuff that was absolutely thrilling, way, way beyond anything we would find at any frequency in Chapel Hill. And John Logue took me actually to a Archaeological Society meeting, I think in 2001 was the first one I went to. And soon thereafter, I guess I had a big triangular point that my stepson had picked up one time out on the lake. One of the rare trips when I went with someone else. It was 4 or 5 inches long, Allendale church triangle, no base, beveled on both sides. So John and I took it to this conference, which was in the basement of the first floor of Capstone. And John said, let's show this to Ken Steffi. He knew Ken. Ken had been a student at USC Sumter a decade or so earlier. So he showed it to Ken, and Ken got very excited about it and took it and showed it to Al, and they decided it was a Cobb's triangular, which was a Taylor preform. Fantastic point. And it had been found by my stepson, Eric. We were standing on this muddy shoal, and I was looking around at my height, and he was about 1/3 of my height, and he looks down at my feet and finds this point and picks it up. It turns out it was fantastic. So that way I got to know Ken Steffi, who lives in Sumter. And I have gone to all the annual conferences since that time. And by 2007, I got up the nerve to give a presentation about what I'd been doing on the lakeshore. But before that, I had gathered maybe a couple hundred points and scrapers and things, and I took them up to Skia one day, and Al spent the better part of the whole, Al Goodyear spent the better part of the whole day working with me. And this kind of thing is great for avocational archaeologists, discovering that professionals are interested in what you're doing. It's so reinforcing. So that's what got me started. There was another day I went up there. Well, I guess the next big event was when I got up the nerve to do a presentation. Had to learn how to do PowerPoint by taking a workshop at USC Sumter given by Jeff Steinmetz, who is now at Francis Marion. And it turned out you were the moderator of that particular conference, and you really made me feel welcome. And that was an important part of my development as an avocational archaeologist. You know, just feeling that people care about what you're doing and want you. It's so important. I can't overemphasize it. So since then, I've found something to talk about, some better than others every year, and hope to continue. I don't know whether we'll be having an in-person conference this year or not. if we don't, I'll have to learn some new technology to do a presentation.
So I suspect we'll have a virtual one like you and I are talking now, but I can help you with that. It's not hard.
Well, I need help.
Yeah, let's see.
I'm very much from the old school, and technology is something I struggle with. I learn what I need to know to do what I want to do, but I don't really understand things fully, such as the capacities of digital cameras. They're fantastic. You can do a great deal of good stuff without knowing what you're doing. And ultimately, not knowing what you're doing can come back to bite you a bit.
Man, I think you're one of the better photographers in South Carolina archaeology. You've mastered something there. If that was by accident, good job.
Well, I keep working at it, but a lot of it is due to the genius of the Olympus company and the cameras they make, and trial and error. It's not that I know anything about photography. And I've been conferring a great deal with Ken Steffi. We've done a lot of presentations and some publications together. We used to meet before the pandemic once a week for 1 to 3 hours and just talk archaeology. And that too is tremendously reinforcing to an avocational archaeologist, having a professional who's willing to talk with them and enjoys talking with them. So that's one of the biggest lessons about what's great about South Carolina archaeology. People like you and Al and Ken who care about what avocational archaeologists are doing and are interested in collections.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's as I've said before in these interviews, it's a win-win. When, you know, there's only so few of us professional archaeologists. There's a lot of people like yourself out there, and we are the beneficiaries of your energy and your work and and the knowledge that you contain. And so,
well, your interest helps generate and maintain that energy.
So what I'm hearing you say, that there's an importance in working with professional archaeologists to get the word out. That might be something you might tell someone just getting into the field of avocational.
Well, the very fact they're accessible is important. I mean, a few of the people I've encountered have had bad experiences with professional archaeologists, such as bringing a pot they had discovered up to Skia and getting it seized. But
I've heard these stories. I don't think that, I think that those are decades old stories, at least I hope.
They are, but I managed to develop a good relationship with one of those young people, and he actually gave me some of the chert tool assemblage pieces that he and his friends had collected before I got there. This was a big event in 2007. I think it was the day before my 67th birthday, would it be?
Yeah. Well, listen, Bob.
Lost count of birthdays.
I know how that goes.
One wants to lose count at this age, I think.
Well, tell us about, I think you're unique in many, many ways. One for coming to the conference, giving papers, for putting an article in the journal every year. But in other ways, you're unique because you are a terrestrial-based collector who is out in a kayak and who has a hobby diver's license.
Oh, yes. Well, on January 27th, 2008, the lake was very, very low. I'd been going out in the kayak since 2000. And I walked down to a part of the shore of Little Persandy, which is a hunter's name for the island north of Persandy. It's an informal name. And I was systematically going back and forth across the acres of lake bed that were dry then, picking up stuff, taking pictures. And one of the things I ran across, in addition to a beautiful Mac point, was a collection of what then was 64 chunks of chert, Allendale chert, which reminded me of some that Al had been looking at down at Topper one of the times I visited, that they had dredged out of the chute or out of the river at that time. And I thought, gee, this is really neat stuff. Here it is. It's all within a radius of about 1 yard. So I put it all in the bag and carried it the 1/4 mile back to my boat, and then went back there to look around. took a GPS mark of where it was. I took pictures of it while I was there too. Well, that turned out to be a very interesting collection. And a few months later, I decided Ken Steffi might be interested in it. So he came over to the university and looked at it and got really excited because it was obvious that several of these were expedient tools. And Ken's very interested in expedient tools. In fact, now one of the things he's doing during the pandemic is napping in his yard and making expedient tools from debitage. But this led to some presentations about that, what we called a cache then, and we now call an assemblage because the intentionality of it was not clear. They could have been used to butcher something and then left there because the something they butchered was more worth carrying than the pieces of rock were. But the technology of that cache or assemblage all was very primitive, pre-Levallois even. So hopefully, if studies continue of it, perhaps that's very early pre-Clovis presence indication, but it'll take some real work to prove that.
Pre-Clovis, that's amazing. Hey, tell us, you've used a few terms here that you might want to explain for our viewers and listeners. You used the term cache, you used the term expedient tool. Tell us what you mean by that.
An expedient tool is one that's useful because it has a sharp edge or could be used for battering simply as it's picked up, either from debitage or, you know, a river cobble that you use as a hammerstone is an expedient tool. But typically, we're thinking of cutting tools. Many flakes that come off good quality material can be used as is without any edge modification. And of course, the use modifies the edges somewhat too. So it's a really interesting area of archaeology that I've become fascinated with. So when I collect, I pick up all kinds of debitage. Sometimes it's very dirty and I can't fully examine it at the time. But if I recognize that it's of some interest, I take the time to turn on the GPS and record the location. Unfortunately, there's some things that go unrecognized at the time you pick them up, so you don't have that specific location.
But you find it very important to record those sites, and I'm glad you do, and the GPS is a great way. You know, nowadays, a lot of people's phones have built-in GPS where you can...
Well, that's an important lesson for avocational archaeologists. Our archaeological heritage essentially is information. And the more information you collect, the more value it has. So if you're out in the field and you see something interesting, take a picture of it, record exactly where it is, maybe make some notes on it. If you have audio capabilities, say something about it at the time. But all of this may turn out to be very important in the long run. For example, I found a Clovis preform proximal on Little Persanti at one point, and I recognized it as interesting enough to record a GPS mark on. Then something like 5 years later, I found another, and when I compared the GPS locations, they were probably within about 10 feet of one another. Now this area I searched is deflated shoreline. Avocationalists can't dig, they can only look for stuff. But the deflation, of course, produces conflation of things of all ages. But if you get two Clovis artifacts about 10 feet apart, the suggestion is that there were Clovis people in that area which deflated something like 13,000 years. There were Clovis people there 13,000 years ago, and now it's deflated. And since this is very close to a bank which is not deflated, this may point to places where professional archaeologists could do systematic digs and find a Clovis presence if they wanted to. Unfortunately, the only way you can get to these islands is by boat. So working there would be tedious.
There's a bit
And
of,
there are lots of routes and there are other priorities, but the information is there.
yeah. So these are sites that are eroding, and you're picking up things that have fallen out, deflated, as the term that you use, and
Well, the sand,
time
what
into-
happens is the soil along the shore, by and large, is sandy. Some of the areas are parabolic source bordering dunes, even particularly along Persanti, but also they show up in the LiDAR pictures of Little Persanti, and they erode very easily. So the sand and silt get carried off, and the denser materials in them deflate. So they're all on whatever surface remains. Of course, from week to week, sand shifts around and covers and then uncovers them. But it's a very interesting kind of area. Ideal for avocational archaeologists because you're not dependent on plowed fields and rain. All the work is being done by the water of the lake. And of course, by the same token, the lake is destroying the sites.
well, that's what we're seeing, culturally induced by the power companies raising the levels of the rivers, and then with climate change and sea level rise, we're seeing the same kind of thing going along at the coast. Our archaeology month theme last year was heritage at risk, and we saw all kinds of sites that are eroding, and in a lot of ways, 10, 20, 30 years from now, some of these might be gone. So it's really good that you're out and about and collecting some information from them, and that you're cognizant of the importance of it.
Yes, the bottom line really is information. That's what our cultural heritage is if you have good pictures and good location data, and in these times you could even do 3D scanning and build models from your 3D scanning data, replicas. The technology is becoming fantastic. So you don't actually have to have the artifact in hand. The information that's derived from it is of tremendous value. And that's one of the themes I would emphasize for avocational archaeologists. Don't underestimate the value of gathering information the best you can about anything you find.
So kind of keep a diary, draw maps, get a GPS location, share that information with the professional archaeologist.
Well, I write notes on index cards too, and the problem with that is sometimes I can't read my writing. Have to decipher it, but if I take a GPS mark, I wrote mark such and such and what I think it is at the time, and I have a database on that, one of which is ordered by mark number and the other is ordered by location, so I can see what kinds of things I found in a particular place. And there's one place that seems to have a nice collection of side-notched points indicating there was a early archaic side-notched occupation there, but there's also everything else. It's amazing what a wonderful place this upper Lake Marion shore seems to have been for people over 13,000 years or so. And I have a feeling that it is because these places I'm searching represent slightly elevated ground that was above the floodplain. And of course, there's plenty growing in the floodplain, and there are animals foraging in the floodplain and drinking water in the floodplain. But it just seems to have been a great place for people over many years. And the later years are evidenced by all that pottery, the 40,000 or so that I donated to you at Lancaster, and there are probably several tens of thousands left in my garage and shed to be processed.
Yes, sir. Let's shift gears here a little bit. What would your advice be to somebody just now getting into avocational archaeology from your perspective over the years? What would be like the top 3 things you might say to somebody?
I would say get in touch with other avocational archaeologists through, say, the Piedmont Archaeological Society and the Archaeological Society of South Carolina, because you need that inspiration. Go to archaeology shows. Piedmont has a show in Camden now. They used to have a great show at Camp Woody, but the show was much greater than the turnout. So it turned out that it wasn't cost effective to keep operating it. Also, another thing that happened is the floods of 2015 wiped out Old River Road near Elliott's Mill. So you had to make a big detour going into Camp Woody. But I think Al Goodyear and Joe Wilkinson got a great deal of valuable information out of that show. So attending shows is really stimulating for avocationalists.
Yeah, I think for a long time, professional archaeologists were sort of against going to shows, but you're absolutely right. Al Goodyear and Joe Wilkinson have shown the utility of.
Well, you see some things it shows that would be deeply disturbing to to a professional archaeologist, such as whole pots that were looted from the mounds along the Watery River near Camden. They're spectacular, but the process by which they ended up in the hands of the owner is not really legitimate. But they're beautiful relics.
So,
and a lot of people at those shows are involved in selling books and selling artifacts. I've not gotten into that. I'm totally interested in information. So emphasizing the information value, recording it is what I would suggest people focus on the most.
How can professional archaeologists better serve folks like you? What can we do differently?
I think in South Carolina, you're doing so well. It's a challenge for me to say what could be done better. Perhaps more outreach to writers for local newspapers. But the problem with that is local newspapers are fading out as a means of communication, so everything is becoming electronic. Newspapers are having trouble surviving, and not everybody reads them. They look at their cell phones. So having a very good website is important.
Yeah. The board of the Archaeological Society of South Carolina is very aware of this, and as you know, this year, we're doing it right now, we're doing Archaeology Month in cyberspace with a website and a Facebook presence. And you're right, newspapers are going away, but you know, the social media platforms of Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, the younger people on the board are telling us this is the way to go. And I think, you know, we need to kind of serve that interest, and guys like you and me got to get better with the technology and start using these things. Let me ask you this. What is the most memorable Native American artifact that you discovered in your time?
Back in February 2001, I had put in my kayak at Pax Landing and paddled a little bit south, and I was looking along kind of a muddy clay shore and saw tip of a point sticking up, and I pulled it up, and it was an absolutely fantastic tricolor Allendale point, called Mala Point back then, but they now are called Allendale. And I was so excited about this point that when I got back to Pax, I put the kayak on top of the car. And I didn't even stop at the house to get rid of the kayak. I drove back to the university to show, and went in my dirty clothes from kayaking to show John Logue this fantastic point. And one interesting thing about this point is I was down at Clariant one time and they had an exhibit of people's cases of points from the area up at the picnic shelter.
That's Allendale.
I was taking pictures of that, and there was a point that looked almost exactly like this. It was gray, kind of reddish beige spots, uncanny. And I was told that this was thermally altered Allendale Church. One of the visitors to one of the artifact shows told me he thought it was, I think, what's it, Horse Creek Church from Tennessee. But Ken has looked at it and he thinks it's Allendale Church. But finding something that fantastic is a real thrill, although the information value isn't nearly as great as finding 64 pieces of chert which turn out to be expedient tools and lead to a major article. And of course, that article was a big thrill also because I got a little award for it that I still have in my display case here in this room. A piece of Catawba pottery. There's that article very generously was awarded the Article of the Year award for South Carolina Antiquities. And that was, creating that article was a tremendous struggle. There was an abortive attempt a year or two earlier and then went back to the drawing boards.
Well, I'm glad the Archaeological Society recognized that. And you certainly are deserving of that award and maybe even deserving of it again in the future for all the publications that you have put in our journal. And, you know, just reminded that often the editors
I'm working on it.
Often the editors are searching for articles and they're beating up the archaeology professionals and they can't find anything. So it's a great place for folks to get.
Well, one thing I think they need to do is more strongly encourage people who do presentations at the conferences to publish them. That could help the content of South Carolina Antiquities quite a bit. It seems as though an awful lot of presentations are done which don't end up as publications.
Yeah. I should tell our viewers that we've been doing a journal for almost 40 years now, and most of those issues are online. And our website is archaeology.sc.org, and you can click on publications, and we've got a 5-year lag of the most recent ones, but Carl Steen and some folks got together, and you can go to our website and read about many of the things Bob's talking about and some of the articles that Bob has written. Well, any final words for our viewers today?
Well, just the upbeat theme that it is wonderful to be an avocational archaeologist in South Carolina, and you're a very important part of what makes it wonderful. And I thank you for this opportunity to chat with you.
Thanks so much, Bob. You're a model in the avocational world for so many reasons, applying your chemistry to the research, publishing, sharing information. And I'm always in awe when you finish your lectures. You always give out a call to people in the avocational audience at the annual conference to come up and get paper and publish. And I think coming from someone like you would be far more important than coming from someone who is a professional archaeologist. So thanks a lot, Bob Costello.
You're welcome.